Hello friends, today we'll be playing Builder of Nations Space Tricks. For those of you who watched my live stream, my previous one, you would know what this deck is. For those of you who didn't, well, you have no idea what you're missing out on. Too bad, let's get on with it. So, I open by playing Archer on R&D because I don't start with a hostile takeover, which means that I can't res the Archer. So the best place to put an unrest Archer is on R&D. It deters the runner from running R&D. As you can see, my opponent gets a Desperado and a Temujin out. If I didn't have Archer on R&D, my opponent will be directing it at R&D and getting lots of free accesses and stealing lots of agendas. The Archer there is a deterrent, even though my opponent doesn't know that it's an ice that I cannot afford to res. Now, since I drew into an ice, I decided to play this for the long haul. Instead of letting my opponent gain the huge credit advantage with Temujin contracts, I am going to ice up archives and force them to bump into the shadow. It is going to be taxing. I gain 2 credits, I land a tag, but more importantly, Builder of Nations fires. I deal 1 meat damage. So that was sweet. And now he tries to hit my HQ, seemingly trying to pull off an apocalypse, but nope. Instead, snipes off the Atlas. I'm not too happy about that, but well, game goes on. I cannot really score at this point. My opponent tries to siphon me, thinking that I couldn't res the ice because I didn't res it last turn, and this is where I res the ice wall to keep her out. So this is one of the interesting tricks that you can use. You don't necessarily have to res your ice walls even though you are able to. By not resing it, I lulled my opponent into a false sense of security and forced the siphon, making it a waste. Now, I have Quandary and Ice Wall. I put the Quandary on R&D because I want to then put Satellite Grid on R&D. So this is a very cute play. Satellite Grid gives your ice 1 advancement counter, whether it is an advanceable ice or not. So my Quandary will have an advancement counter when I res the Satellite Grid. This means I can inflict Builder of Nations damage using a Quandary, which is ridiculous. This is why Satellite Grid is super good in Builder of Nations. It allows you to trigger your ID ability even without having to find your advanceable ice, without having to actually advance your ice. So that's one very cool thing. I also like it in this deck because it serves as remote fodder. You can toss it in a remote and play Never Advance style, kind of a bit like Jammy HB. And your opponent will just be punished into taking meat damage if they fall for the trap. So now my opponent tries to continue sec testing Temujin archives and takes the meat damage from Builder of Nations. So that's a very cool thing. Builder of Nations is making Temujin contracts a lot less shiny. Sure, my opponent is still getting good money, but they are paying the cost. Unfortunately, because I am focusing all my attention on making my central so spiky, I have no opportunity to score out. Thankfully, I am not really agenda flooded. I haven't seen any Jacksons, but no agendas either. Instead, what I'm seeing are my combo cards. Scorched Earth is there to punish the runner who attempts to tag float or smacks into one of my Pricex. As for Trick of Light, that is another one of my outs when it comes to scoring agendas. You need some sort of fast advance option because as Wayland, it's very difficult to actually score agendas properly. You don't have EOI, and your flatline plan isn't really the best, so you actually need to score agendas the hard way. And fast advance is basically one of the best ways to score agendas right now. So, another piece of ice on R&D. Sorry, HQ. This HQ ice is an ice wall. It is nigh penetrable. Very, very penetrable to the runner because, don't forget, Andromeda actually has paperclip in her bin, so she can actually break through my HQ all the way. The only reason I'm putting it on HQ is as deterrence, to ensure that my opponent doesn't randomly, smack into it with an account siphon. But she still goes through with the legwork, so I'm just going to keep the outer ice unres for now. This is one of the arts of playing that runner. Not resing ice. Sometimes you have to keep your calm, keep control of the hidden information. And one way to do that is to not res ice. It sounds very counterintuitive, but sometimes that's the right decision. That ice wall is only going to cost my opponent 1 extra credit to break with the paperclip. Why bother resing it? I'm just going to leave it there outside, make it that much harder for my opponent to convince herself that playing that account siphon is the right choice. Anyway, my opponent bumps into an ice wall and fetches the paperclip. The ice wall is of strength 4 I think. 2, I can't really see, sorry. In any case, she only needs to pay 1 credit because she has a lot of sucker counters. She comes in and sees all my combo cards. I find the Pricex. Alright, the Pricex is very juicy at this point, so I'm going to put it in the remote server. Usually what I do with Pricex is it serves as my Ash, defensive upgrade. My opponent cannot afford to run last click because it might be a snare, or obviously the price tag that will cause certain death. So I'm just going to leave in the server and wait until I am able to score it. So my job right now is to try to find more ice because I have to respect inside job from my opponent. But instead I draw an agenda, so I'm just going to push out right here. It's an Oak Town. My opponent's not on match point, so I'm not too I'm not too concerned about losing this agenda. It's quite bad if I do, but at least I'm gaining credits even while advancing it. So this is the beauty of Oak Town. You are not really losing even if your opponent steals the agenda, and you get to trigger Builder of Nations and Price Tag. So this could hopefully open up. Employee strike. That's a thing, I guess. So employee strike removes the tempo hit from my opponent, face checking my ice. It wouldn't make a difference whether he played the strike or not, but oh man, it made it so bad for me to rest the ice wall. So I didn't even bother. I made him hit the price tag, but she managed to clear the tag. And now I get agenda flooded. So this is a very bad situation for me. I'm forced to actually ditch one of my combo pieces. I can't afford to ditch an agenda at this point because Temujin is pointed at archive, so my opponent can easily discover me stashing agendas there if I choose to stash. So at this point, my only option is to fast advance the Atlas out of my hand because I'm completely flooded. If my opponent plays a legwork at this point, they more or less win. In fact, they are certain to win, so I can only hold my breath and hope a same one thing doesn't hit the board. This is looking very bad for me. Thankfully, it's an account siphon. It sounds really weird saying this, but siphon is so much better than legwork at this point. So the siphon goes through, and I'm quite sure my opponent will clear tags, knowing that they saw 2 scorches from my hand. So tags go away. They don't know that I actually ditched one of my scorchters, but I do draw the final one, so it doesn't really matter. So at this point, drawing to my next piece of ice, it's the wormhole. I basically have to advance it 3 times before attempting to score anything. So at this point, my biggest concern is that my opponent has her entire rig set up. The Anarch Breaker Suite, this is so 2013 Netrunner. You're just playing the Anarch Breaker Suite in Criminal and it's deadly strong. With all the run-based economy between Temujin, Desperado, and security testing, along with data suckers, you can get through any server. So actually, one of my biggest priorities right now is to purge virus counters. There is nothing I'm going to be able to do with my wormhole if my opponent can just break through it with York, and all my other eyes are very cheap gear checks that are now pretty useless. My opponent is really rich. So literally the only thing I can do now is to tax out the Mimic and the York by taxing out the Data Sucker. So at this point I look, I purge, and I pass the turn. It doesn't really mean much. A smart opponent would simply hammer archives for all the Temujin money and get all the sucker counters. And that's exactly what my opponent does. She bumps into archives. Again, this is at no cost to her, even though Builder of Nations is a very strong counter to Temujin. Unfortunately, Employee Strike counters the Builder of Nations, so my opponent is able to run through my advanced eyes with impunity. However, she makes the big mistake of running to R&D with only 2 sucker counters. Yike! That is a big mistake. Suddenly, what seemed like my game to lose heavily swung in my favor. The program trashes were huge. I had to choose carefully which ones to trash. I chose to keep the Mimic because I don't really have any sentries I'm worried about. I'm more worried about the Data Sucker because it enables the rest of her breakers to work, and obviously the York is way too efficient at what it does. With York off the table, my quandaries now have teeth. My wormhole on the remote cannot be broken. I make a gamble here, hoping that she doesn't run inside job. If she doesn't, I'm going to score this Oak Town. If she does, she gets the match point, but I'm not out of this just yet, and I forced out one inside job. So we'll see if that works. Yes, there's no inside job, I'm going to score it. So at this point, I'm thinking to myself, what card do I want to ditch from my hand? Do I want to play the Hedge Fund and score the Oak Town? Because I have 1 more click left. I score the Oak Town, and I decide that I don't really have time to mess around, so I'm going to immediately slot the food in the remote. Another reason why I put the food in the remote is because 2 reasons. Firstly, it doesn't look like an agenda, so my opponent is very unlikely to go for it. More importantly, I have to respect the legwork. Remember that HQ is wide open. 2 ice walls. My opponent doesn't know that, but if she blindly legworks, I don't want her to win off 2 agendas, so I want to keep only 1 agenda in hand at this point. Okay, the inside job was a thing, so I could choose to rest both ice or neither. Obviously, I'm going for neither. I value the hidden information more, so I pass out the food. If the inner ice was the wormhole instead of the ice wall, I would have been able to keep her out, maybe even devastate her a lot more. But that wasn't the case, so she's now on match point. But as I said, I have managed to force out the inside job. So now what I'm going to do is to make Wormhole the innermost piece of ice. It comes at a cost. The outermost ice has to be the Archer. But, well, you have to do what you have to do. Archer into Wormhole is a super secure server. My opponent only has one ferry, and that ferry could very well be used to bust down R&D. Again, Employee Strike is still up. Even though I scored the Oaktown earlier, my opponent managed to recur the Employee Strike, which is really annoying. So, Builder of Nations is still not doing anything. Employee Strike is just killing it, which is really making me really sad, because my opponent is actually running very low on cards, and if Builder of Nations is actually allowed to fire, I would actually be very close to decking out my opponent at this point. She was still able to get card draw, get her runs, get a run-based economy going, simply because her Employee Strikes completely turned off my run deterrence. And that's what Builder of Nations is designed to do. To defend against very aggressive runners. Unfortunately, Employee Strike just shuts that down. And that, I feel, is just very sad. I can't really afford to spend deck space to pack currents. I only have a 44 card deck. Now I'm going to shut my opponent completely out of R&D by raising the Quandary here. With no access to R&D or my remote, I feel actually very safe now. There are no agendas in my hand, so I can safely just pump agendas from R&D into the remote with no counterplay from my opponent. So actually, it looks like I'm just going to win this game. Purely based off the fact that my opponent... Oh, I take that back. She does have a backup passport, and that passport is going to get her through R&D. Just once, because she only has 2 copies of Fairy. Doesn't seem like she has a backup data sucker, so the fairies are going to be limited in use, but she does manage to trash a price tag, trash my security, satellite grid, but that satellite grid actually manages to deal 1 meat damage to my opponent before getting trashed, because Builder of Nations is now active. Without Employee Strike out, I can now deal meat damage once again. And with satellite grid gone, I now want to put an advanceable ice on R&D, so that running any server at this point is going to cost my opponent 1 meat damage. This is actually going to become very relevant with my opponent going to deck out very soon. I'm looking forward to that. I could possibly win in 2 different ways. I could win by decking out, I could win by scoring out. Remember, I only need 3 more points. There's a global foot left in my deck. If I draw it and I install double advance, there's a very good chance I just win straight out. My opponent cannot break the remote Wormhole with passport. So I have to choose ice to advance here. Advancing the shadow seems pretty meaningless. I mean, sure, I can get it out of mimic range, but firing a shadow isn't the end of the world. I definitely want to fortify HQ here, but basically just make everything a lot more nasty looking. At this point, I've really transitioned into the Glacier phase, one that tries to grind out my opponent. My opponent has run out of deck completely, 5 hit points left, but only 1 agenda needed to win. So my opponent has to consider the options very carefully here. They decide to just take 4 credits. And I do find the Project Atlas here. I'm very tempted to slot it in the remote, but given the fact that my opponent was playing so conservatively instead of trying to run for the winning access, even though they have drawn the entire deck, I'm actually very cautious. I'm thinking my opponent might have a Femme Fatale in their hand. That is the only reason why they wouldn't be running last turn. They could run R&D, they could run HQ. The reason she wasn't running was because she was waiting for me to score an agenda in the remote, so she could snipe it with Femme. Given that I'm not taking the bait, she drops the same old thing instead. What is she going to do? Is she going to same old legwork? That could end the game. I have the winning agenda in hand. That could end the game. But what is she going to do with same... Yep, she's going to same old legwork right here for the game. I deal 1 meat damage, bringing her down to 3 hit points. She hit Scorched Earth, Trick of Light, the same 3 cards that she saw on her very first legwork. The Atlas dodge. 40% chance. 40% that Atlas survives. Do I risk my chances? There's still a chance that my opponent has the Femme in hand. I could put in a remote, or I could just fast advance it with Trick of Light. I mean, since I have the Trick of Light, I decided to just fast advance it. I have 2 hostile takeovers in my deck, so if I top deck any one of them, I would win. So I'm waiting for the hostile for the win, and I might as well put my Trick of Light here to good use. We are both on 6 points. This is a lot more tense than it should have been. If she didn't place faceplant into the archer, this game would have been long over. My opponent would have ran all over me and those employee strikes. I told you the fem was there. I knew the fem was there. And she lost patience. She knew I wasn't going to score behind the remote because I knew she had the fem. So she smartly went for R&D instead. Going for R&D. How many agendas in my deck? How many? 3, I think. 2 hostile takeovers. 1 global food. Or 1 atlas. 1 food. 4 agendas. She misses it. That must have been a 1-3 shot. She now hits HQ, a very smart thing to do. Given that she already triggered Builder of Nations, might as well make them fullest of it by running HQ again. I draw the hostile. But I can't keep her out of HQ. If she runs HQ 4 times here, she has a very good shot of winning. But no, she goes for R&D instead. I take out her last card with Builder of Nations. If she doesn't win this turn, I win the game. She has no solution. No solution at all for my meat damage. So she has to run. She has to run for all 3 clicks, and the only server she can run at this point is HQ. She can run HQ 3 times and give herself a more than 50% chance of winning the game. But she hits the wormhole. She tries again. Click 3. Second last click. 1 single access. Is it going to happen? She accesses hedge fund. And she clicks it for credit. She should have hit my hand 1 more time. There was no reason for her not to. But she just got very unlucky with accesses. That was one of the worst streaks of luck I've ever witnessed. 60% chance to win on that legwork. She missed. 2 runs on HQ. That 1 agenda. Whiffed again. Oh man. I had absolutely no business winning this game whatsoever. Now I want to spend the end of this video talking about a completely unrelated topic. Meta homeostasis. This is basically asking yourselves, what does the new card pool offer? What changes people will make to the decks based on it? And how to react to those changes such that your deck will be on top of the meta. These are considerations that I make when preparing for a major tournament like the regionals or nationals, and perhaps this is something that you can learn from. So let's start by giving a couple of examples. That are somewhat pertinent to this Builder of Nations deck as well. So, one of the card pool changes that was made recently is that powerful new identities entered the card pool, especially on the co-op side with controlling the message. That is the cause. The effect of that is that more runners will pack and play strike in response. So the lesson learned here is to avoid co-op decks that heavily depend on the ID combo ability to win. Decks such as, what's a good example? Can't really think of any off the top of my head. Blue Sun, for example. You don't really want to play Blue Sun in a climate where everyone's packing Employee Strike, because your oversight AIs will be dead. You can't bounce your curtain wall backs, but curtain walls back. You become very crippled. My Builder of Nations deck really doesn't like being employee struck. Even though I'm not completely depending on my ID ability to win, it's more of an attrition ID. The fact that I tried to play an attrition style game, a Glacier style game, to tax out my opponent's cards, didn't work very well because my opponent was packing the right hate card for it. So it wasn't so much that my deck was built badly against my opponent, it's just that I played in a style that wasn't suitable given that my opponent's hate card. So that is something I need to keep in mind. Another example of meta homeostasis is the printing of Temujin. Now there are lots of implications for this high economy, high power card, but the fact that it's run based and in criminal means that players will now more likely gravitate towards run based criminals. And this means using the most efficient breakers, the fixed Anarch breakers, in conjunction with Data Sucker, which is fueled by your runs, your Temujin runs. So what's the lesson learned here? If you play a co-op deck that involves program trashing, suddenly those decks look much more appealing than they did a few months ago, with Anarchs with sufficient recursion and files running all over the place. It was much better than in prepaid Kate times where they have clone chips to back up their programs. If people start coming to criminal and people start playing breakers that they cannot recur, program trashing suddenly looks a lot better. and ideally with CVS, which can burn a data cycle at instant speed, forcing the runner to hit an archer, hopefully without a fairy. That is pretty devastating. One last example. Temujin and Rumor Mill, both in Blood Money, cause a lot of problems. A lot of people will now gravitate towards Anarch and Criminal, which are very good at denying Glacier decks and Tag Storm decks due to them becoming rich and being able to remote lock with a combination of Rumor Mill, Blackmail, and Inside Job, and just lots of money with the right breakers. The lesson learned from this change is to play fast advanced decks, because these Anarch and Criminal decks typically don't pack plot. Kill decks are also good, because kill decks can generally just mess up an opponent's plans as long as they don't pack too much hate against it. Sure, Anarch has I5 worse, but you can always run them down. And this is why hybrid decks start to shine a lot, especially like my Builder of Nations deck. If you have both a kill component and a fast advance component, your opponent has to be kept on their toes. They can't trip up. They have to respect both win conditions. Now, I'm not saying that my Builder of Nations deck is tier 1 by any means. In fact, it's a pretty lousy deck. You're using really subpar eyes. Wormhole is really not the best. There are too many binary eyes, and the Gender Suite isn't the best. Trick of Light isn't the best fast advance tool either, but it is made a lot better simply because of the climate of the current meta. I was never going to win that game against Andromeda, but with a bit of luck, a lot of luck actually, and some good meta calls, I'm able to pull out the victory from the seat of my pants. Thanks for watching and happy net running. Goodbye.